Steve, and I'm deeply honored to be the first speaker of the 50th anniversary of the Lake Committees. My job is to do about 200 years of fishery governance and history in 30 minutes. What I'm going to cover is basically the ruin, the cooperation that occurred to help lead to the recovery of the fishery, and then the process that we all enjoy today to do cross-border governance. You're going to hear a few things as well that I've uncovered in the archives that haven't been heard in about 50 years. With that, let me just start with saying that fish have always attracted people to the region. Just like we go out and try and lure fish to our bait, fish has lured settlers and people to the region since the time of European settlement, and certainly before. I like this quotation from a Jesuit missionary in the 1650s. I might say that he filled the rivers anew with fish expressly for us. Or a Toronto newspaper ad of 1798. Above all, it, meaning a plot of land, it affords an excellent salmon fishery, large enough to support a number of families, which must be conceived a great advantage in this infant country. Here's a couple of photographs of commercial fishing operations in the early 1900s, Bay of Plenty and Port Dover and such. In the late 1800s, however, or by the late 1800s, there was growing deep concern about the status of the fishery and what human exploitation was doing to that fishery. In those days, there wasn't a lot of assessment work going on in the lakes. Today, of course, we hear assessment reports on a regular basis, and we have a very keen understanding. Back then, you would strike a commission or form a board, get a high-level official who would lead an investigation. And by the late 1800s, no fewer than 10 major investigations leading into the early 1900s occurred. This is Spencer Baird, a name that should be familiar to most of you. He was the first curator of the Smithsonian Institution, but also the U.S. Fish Commissioner, and led some of the early and best, at the time, fishery assessments in the Great Lakes. What Spencer Baird and the others who had done those assessments had shown was deep reason to be concerned. The whitefish, for example, between 1879 and 1899 had dropped by 2/3. Sturgeon from about 8 million pounds to about 2 million pounds. Atlantic salmon, probably the first of the species to go in the Great Lakes, all but collapsed by that time. Commercial fishers then, with the loss of these species, turned to other species like lake trout and herring, and you can see as these high-level surveys shown, those species became stressed as well. There was no shortage of ideas as well in this period about what to do about the problem. This is Seth Green, a fish culturist, probably the father of modern fish culture, along with Samuel Wilmot of Ontario. They took their show on the road. This is an exhibition advertised occurring in London, England in the 1800s about how to do fish culture. The issue, however, is sometimes the basic philosophies among the jurisdictions, Michigan, Ontario, or U.S. states and the Canadian province, were wildly different. Instead of, say, conserving the fish or regulating the commercial fishers, there was interest in raising fish or doing fish culture operations. What we learned also then later is that, as we talked about the collapse of the fisheries and the human effect on that fishery management itself was also lacking quite significantly. This is Walter Koltz. Does anybody meet him? He died in the 1990s. Apparently was quite a character. This sort of a world traveler, and it's him in a Tibetan trip, I think. The preservation of the fisheries has been discussed often during the past 50 years, and more excellent suggestions have been made than have been followed. For Charles Fish, the appropriately named surveyor in Lake Erie in 1926, the depletion appears to have resulted from overfishing and unwise fishing, by protecting the spawning grounds during the breeding season, by increasing the number of hatcheries, by reducing the number of undersized fish destroyed in the nets, and if necessary, by limiting the catch, one may hope for improvement. In other words, what these two individuals were saying, and others at the time were saying, is that fishery management needs to happen. We need to have some sort of management in this if we expect to protect and save the fishery. Here's the problem. Seem to be advancing. Here is the problem. There's another problem. Nick?
There we go.
Okay, here's the problem. We have 8 states in the Great Lakes Basin, the province of Ontario, and later in the 1980s an emerging tribal governance in the Great Lakes Basin. There's a political situation ripe for conflict. Conflict is going to occur when a resource is shared. That's inevitable. The question is does that conflict turn to competition over the resource, or does it turn to cooperation? Do you find a way to cooperate, or do you find a way to compete? Up until the 1950s, as I'll talk about, this conflict led to competition. You had 8 states, province of Ontario, sometimes wildly different opinions about how that fishery could be managed. So if you hear from people like Walter Koltz or Charles Fish talking about management problems, part of it arises from the fact that you have diffused political authorities in the Great Lakes Basin. We all know that. That's why we're here at these lake committees. That's why we have 8 states, province, and tribal and federal officials here. This is a shared resource, and we need to work together. The problem, of course, was that the competition was pretty fierce. This is a list of attempts at cooperation from the late 1800s up until the 1940s. There are no fewer than about 20 or 30 attempts at cooperation that folks tried to do across borders. Here's one example. This was from 1904. There was a conference of state officials. We did agree upon several recommendations to be made to the respective legislatures of the states. But the sad sequel of it all is that no 2 of the legislatures agreed to or nor followed these recommendations. So we're just where we were started, nothing accomplished. You read the accounts of these time and time again from each of these listed in here, and they all end with something along the lines of nothing accomplished, or no 2 jurisdictions passed the same regulations, or we wasted our time. In 1908, a treaty was proposed to try and deal with this problem. This was a national treaty, so it would have been coast to coast between the United States and Canada. You might recall, for the IJC folks in the audience, this was also about the time of the Boundary Waters Treaty. So we're in the progressive era now, where the countries were trying to find ways to be progressive and proactive in dealing with environmental matters. We would have beat your Boundary Waters Treaty, Mark, by a year if this treaty had passed, but it didn't. And here's why. What this treaty did is it gave a commission the authority over all shared fisheries in the boundary waters. And it was rejected because of the fact that it was a way overstretch, really, of the authority that the states and the province had. Here's another example of a failed attempt at cooperation in getting into the late 1920s. An effort was made to form an acceptable code of uniform regulations for Lake Huron, but no definite action was taken by either government after the conference. So we, time and again, were full of examples of these kinds of problems happening across border. In 1943, there was an International Board of Inquiry. They formed it, struck another committee, and this International Board of Inquiry made up of a guy named Gallagher and a guy named Van Oosten. Many of you know the Van Oosten name, prominent scientists in the Great Lakes Basin. And this Board of Inquiry did some investigations. They looked at the state of the fishery. One of the really neat things about this document, if you've not read it, and it's out there, it should be in your libraries, is it not only was Spencer Baird-like assessment of the fishery and what's going on there, but it was also a stinging indictment on the lack of cross-border governance and cooperation in the Great Lakes. It's a wonderful document. Uniformity of regulations and enforcement are impossible to achieve under the present system of divided state control of the fisheries. Since the province of Ontario shared with the states the jurisdiction of the fishes in the boundary waters, it was determined that the promulgation of an international treaty between the United States and Canada is the only practical method of obtaining uniform regulations and uniform enforcement. So this Board of Inquiry recommended a treaty as the only way to deal with that. Ironically, by the way, they also talk about the desirability of an interstate compact, which is not a treaty. So I don't know why they use the word only here, because their own document talks about other methods as well to skin this cat. What resulted from this? Treaty proposed again in 1946. This was a treaty that, instead of being like unlike the 1908 being coast to coast, this was just the Great Lakes. And what this treaty did is it gave an international commission, a Great Lakes Fishery Commission-like organization, the authority to set open and closed seasons, size limits, and so on. In other words, all of the authority that is reserved to this day for the states, the province, and the tribes. And this treaty was the subject of intense debate. Here's a great exchange which gives you an idea of still the parochialism that occurred in the Great Lakes Basin between the states and Canada. This was an exchange between Congressman Weichel, who apparently was unaware that the War of 1812 ended 134 years before, and a guy named Albert Day, who was then the head of the Fish and Wildlife Service. Congressman Weichel, as you're talking about this treaty, the English, that's you Canadians, the English did not invite the Americans over there to share control of their freshwater lakes, but you invite them over here to have something to say about ours. Mr. Day, you might carry that same philosophy forward in the manner of all treaties. Weigel, but what you're doing here, you're taking something that belongs to the individual states, and it does not belong to the federal government, and trying to take it away from the states. It belongs to the states. Mr. Day, no. Mr. Weigel, that it is what it is when you ask for a commission of 2 English and 2 Americans to tell you when you can fish and where and how in the waters that belong to the states. So what happened is this treaty, this commission that was being proposed was subject to this kind of discussion as well. Parochialism is not dead. Also, states and provincial rights were not dead. I should say, by the way, that Congressman Weigel's opinion here was prominent and influential, but it certainly was not universal. There are a lot of folks out there, when you read other parts of the hearing, who were very clear about the need for a binational treaty, including those cited in the International Board of Inquiry. Nevertheless, that opinion carried the day, and this Treaty of 1946 also failed. But then there was this, the last straw that came about to the Great Lakes. And the Sea Lamprey Invasion essentially had the effect of jolting the jurisdictions, whether it's federal, state, provincial, or whatever, out of the parochialism and toward combating a common enemy. And this was something that was unseen in the Great Lakes. They documented decline of the fishery, of course, Spencer Baird and on. We documented the parochialism and the lack of governance and good management. What we also then documented as we watched the decline of the fishery was the impact of this invasive species. Here's a quote from a letter from Claude Verdine, who many of you I'm sure had met, to Congressman or Senator Hubert Humphrey, who was chairing the subcommittee looking at the Convention on Great Lakes Fisheries. My dear Senator, he actually wrote that. My dear Senator, we believe that a program to control the sea lamprey and rehabilitate our fisheries cannot succeed unless carried out simultaneously by both countries. What he's basically saying is that this was too big of a problem to for one country to take on alone, and certainly to expect the states to manage. So, again, another treaty proposed called the Convention on Great Lakes Fisheries, 1954, largely in response to the Sea Lamprey Invasion, but also in response to the fact that we had very little scientific understanding, even with those surveys that were going on. And there was a massive amount of parochialism that still existed with the states and the province trying to manage the fishery. So the scope of is in the Great Lakes, focus on science, sea lamprey control, and working arrangements. Why did this treaty get people's attention in a good way compared to the others? Because there was a little clause in here, Article 10, which says that basically nothing in the convention prohibits this commission from encroaching on what is the management responsibilities of the states and the province, but it also said that the states and the province can't encroach upon the authority of the Fishery Commission as stated in the treaty. In other words, the savings clause said that fishery management is not going to be taken over by this binational institution. And this treaty was approved because folks were more than happy to turn over the sea lamprey problem to this binational commission, and B, it reserved or preserved the rights of the non-federal agencies to do their jobs in the Great Lakes. What's remarkable about the Convention on Great Lakes Fisheries and the Great Lakes Fishery Commission is that this was the first formal body, permanent body on the Great Lakes, and certainly at a high level, to facilitate that cross-border cooperation. It was composed of high-level appointees, commissioners by the Privy Council and the President, and it served as a focal point for discussions. The Fishery Commission very quickly became that focal point for discussions. Article 6 of the Convention has this little clause in here that says this is homage to the parochialism that occurred. The Commission may seek to establish and maintain working arrangements with public and private organizations. And it was this clause that became really the genesis of the Lake Committee process and why we're all here today. So with sea lampreys on track, and with finally a permanent institution to deal with cross-border cooperation, by 1964, the Commission turned to this clause and talked about the importance of seeking and maintaining working arrangements. Lake committees were first proposed at the 1964 interim meeting, which was held at the Department of State. One of the things about the Fishery Commission, as I go back and look at its files, is that we were terrible about taking pictures. We didn't take pictures of anything. It's been about maybe 10 years 15 years with Ted Lawrence and others who are very good at picture taking. As luck would have it, The 1964 interim meeting where they formed the lake committees was well documented. The State Department photographer took a lot of pictures and actually sent them, and they've been in our files here. So we actually have not only photographs but recordings of the formation of the lake committee. So for the first time in 50 years, and I mean this, we dug these tapes out of the basement just a few weeks ago and had them digitized. Went back and I listened to the 1964 interim meeting. I will play for you the announcement and the decision that Commissioner McKernan, that's him there, he's the federal commissioner, at the time head of the Bureau of Commercial Fisheries, proposing the lake committees and setting this forward to the commission. So roll the tape.
We do feel that the work of the commission is getting more complex, requires...
Okay.
We do feel that the work of the Commission is getting more complex, requires some additional thought and consideration, and we are proposing, beginning at the next annual meeting, to handle our affairs in a slightly different manner with the view of trying out, in a sense, experimenting with handling the regular work of the Commission through several committees. On the blackboard, we have indicated the direction that we're thinking. We would set up 4 committees: a Finance and Administration Committee, a Scientific Advisory Committee, a Lamprey Research and Control Committee, and a Management and Research Committee to handle the work of the Commission during the Commission meeting. The Management and Research Committee would itself be composed of chairman of a number of lake committees. We would like to strengthen the work of the states and province in the development of programs of conservation and management on all of the Great Lakes. We feel that this may be a good mechanism for doing so. I'm very happy for the acceptance of the Commission of this idea. I think it means, in my view, another step forward by the Commission in its growth and maturity, and I'm convinced that it will lead to a more complete deliberation on the important matters that are facing the Commission today.
So there you have it. Thus the lake committees were born. I didn't hear any champagne corks, but it said it rather as a matter of factly there. Lester Voigt, who is a commissioner in the same era from the state of Wisconsin, provides the agreement from the U.S. section. Roll the tape.
We discussed this proposed organizational form with the United States section this morning, so I think that they are aware that this is essentially the discussion we've had with few modifications, and we feel that while it isn't a radical departure from organizational form of other governmental and corporate policy-making bodies, yet now we're at the position where this type of organization will be effective for us. So as far as the United States section is concerned, we're happy to try it, and I have high hopes that it will be effective.
I think it was, Commissioner. And finally, this little nugget from the tape, there's a Commissioner A.L. Pritchard. I don't know what A.L. stands for, and I confess I tried for about an hour to figure out what Commissioner Pritchard's first name was, so we'll call him Al. A.L. Pritchard. He is a Canadian head of fish culture of DFO in Ottawa. And Commissioner Pritchard decided to weigh in as well on the formation of these lake committees. And what I really like about this is that he was still very cognizant of the fact that there is a sort of state and provincial management and how the Fishery Commission would be perceived in this.
And I would like to indicate to the Commission, especially to those who are responsible for various administrations, that there isn't here, nor could there be, any indication of a Commission taking over the responsibilities which belong to the various organizations that are involved here. This is merely to do our job properly. And in that, I might say that the main problem is that the Commission might take over control. Now, there's some of you who would like that, but I can assure you that the great majority would like to have nothing to do with it, mainly because they don't like the commissioners. But nevertheless, I think this is something we should stress.
A year later, Norm Norm Baldwin, the executive secretary of the commission at the time, addressed the first lake committees. They met in the spring of 1965, all but the Lake Huron Committee, which met first in 1966. I don't know why the Lake Huron Committee took an extra year. Maybe I'll figure that out someday. But Norm Baldwin, addressing the group of the lake committees, went around and talked about what he thought their duties would be. And I think this really set the stage as well, and kind of to let the lake committees know what their job was to be. A lake committee has no special powers, and agencies administering or investigating the fishery were not required to carry out any action it might recommend. However, since it was composed of senior staff from agencies responsible for the fishery, the likelihood that actions it recommended would be implemented after approval by the commission and governments would be increased. What Mr. Baldwin was basically saying is that the lake committees would succeed because the same people who were part of the lake committees were also going to be responsible for carrying out the actions. I love this little part too. The actions recommended after approval by the commission. So I wonder if he and Pritchard had a little question about how that was. I never saw this in the minutes afterwards, by the way. There never was an instance where the lake committees brought something forward and said, here's what we're going to do. Is the commission okay with it? And that was quickly dropped from that. Baldwin continued, although the commission would wish to have any questions it referred to a lake committee considered fully, there would be no limitation on matters to which these committees would be able to discuss. What he's basically saying is that these lake committees would be empowered to do what they wanted. This is a typical lake committee agenda from about 1965 to 1981. And if you go back in the agenda, with the exception of a few different words here, they reported out the status of fish, current environmental conditions, management issues, progress of investigations, and other business. These were nearly identical across lake and across the year. I was doing some interviews with fishery managers about a decade ago, and I asked them what this first era was like. And I got a quote like this: you give your report at the meeting, you sit down, and you think, oh, Jesus, when is this going to end? These were not overly exciting meetings in this era. But it was momentous because it was the first time that there were regular interactions among the states and the province. The tribes had not yet become part of the process. And they would, share information. They may not have been the most exciting, but they were regular bodies for doing that. What changed? The lake committees going into the 1970s and coming out of the 1970s with the 1981 Joint Strategic Plan were very different entities. And what changed? Well, first of all, the 1970s was an environmental era. Henry Regier, in an article that he has in this edition of the Journal of Great Lakes Research, if you haven't read it, it's a nice short piece about sort of the history of whatever comes out of Henry's mind. It was he called this era the Great Laurentian Spring. In the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, there was also a significant attention on Great Lakes improvement in water quality. Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, think of what happened in that decade. It was a time when we could no longer tolerate burning rivers, post-Silent Spring, alewife die-offs, and pollution in the Great Lakes. So going into it, the fishery people clearly need to step up their game, and it was within the spirit of the times. What else happened in this era? There was deep concern about marginalization, that the fishery interests would be marginalized. Here's a quote from Bill Pierce, former director at NYSDEC. Bill Pierce was saying in a report to the IJC's Water Quality Board, our interests, fisheries, are competing with some real heavies. I'm going to read this a little longer than what's up there. I have an image of a boardroom in which the principals are sitting around the table in their dark three-piece suits and ties, white shirts and shiny black shoes. Naturally, they're smoking big stogies. They represent, among others, shipping, heavy industry, municipal government, and utilities. On the edge of the crowd is a barefoot Huck Finn. That's been us. Maybe I should say, or that's us. Maybe I should say that's been us, because we're beginning to have an impact. And Mr. Pierce goes on to talk about the fact that fishery interests were beginning to become more and more inserted into the process because of the fact that they were marginalized in the past. Fishery managers as well felt deep concern about federal preemption in this era. When I asked a fishery manager why the Joint Strategic Plan debate began in the 1970s, late 70s, he said, I know quite precisely why. There was an effort motivated by NOAA to extend the Magnuson Act to the Great Lakes and create a council and engage NOAA here. And the states responded to that as a challenge to the jurisdiction. That's what started the Joint Strategic Plan exercise. This fishery manager had every reason to be concerned. In 1976, there was a report from the General Accounting Office to Congress that looked at fisheries. And in this report, one conclusion was domestic fisheries management has been uncoordinated and ineffective. The report went on to say that Congress should consider enacting legislation which would give the Secretary of Commerce, this is through NOAA, authority to impose management measures in fisheries under domestic jurisdiction in case such measures are not implemented by the states in a timely manner. What the states were basically looking at that is if you don't organize, and we have this Magnuson Act now, even though it officially exempted NOAA from the Great Lakes, Congress was very concerned about disorganization and a lack of management. They were worried as well about those barefoot Huck Finns in the room who were not asserting themselves and being part of the fishery management process. So that's number two. There is a concern about preemption. Then we have this thing called the Great Lakes Basin Commission. Lyndon Johnson set this up in the late 1960s. And this Great Lakes Basin Commission was set up to look at a whole number of things, including fisheries. They had to do 50-year plans on a whole number of issues, and one of them was a Great Lakes fishery management plan. And Lee Botts, at the time, who was the director, she's still around. Many of you know Lee Botts. She was wondering, how do I do a 50-year management plan? I emphasize the word management on that one. So she came to the Great Lakes Fishery Commission and confessed to me one day, by the way, when I asked her about this, that she kind of figured how Carlos Fedorov would react to this. He said, we're going to do this 50-year fishery management plan. Carlos said, no way. If any fishery management plan is going to be done, we're going to do it. We're going to do it through this lake committee process, and we're not going to have this basin commission try and tell the fishery managers what to do. Lee confessed to me that she knew exactly what she was doing because that's how Carlos would react. So what happened is they convened then the fishery managers to do this plan, and instead of being a Great Lakes fishery management plan, it became a strategic Great Lakes fishery management plan. That's how you get the SIGLFMP acronym. Even though it's called the Joint Strategic Plan for Management of Great Lakes Fisheries, it held that old acronym that Lee Botts started. The bylaws of this Basin Commission said that they are to work with the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. So what emerged as well, and that's important to remember, is that there was a fear of federal preemption not being at the table, this Great Lakes Basin Commission plan, the existence of a neutral third party already being in the Great Lakes Fishery Commission to facilitate this plan. That's what came out then in 1981. This is Carlos Fedorov and Buzz Posadny signing the Joint Strategic Plan. What's unique about this plan and what's different about it than the lake committees? Well, for one thing, it's a strategic plan. It means that it's going to be, instead of a management plan, it's going to set up a process like this to help the managers identify and then carry out their objectives. Non-binding, non-regulatory, so it's completely in line with our 200 years of history and parochialism in the lakes, but instead it focuses on consensus and collective action. This is the lake committee structure today, and it's actually not too dissimilar from the lake committee structure that was established in 1964, except instead of sort of being at the top, Council of Lake Committees or the Council of Great Lakes Fishery Agencies, you might recall, we originally set it up so that it reported to an internal committee at the Fishery Commission. That's long gone. But we still have the lake committees. There's been an emergence and a growth of technical committees with that expertise and some high-level governance in the Great Lakes Basin. Again, this structure is really not too off from where it was. Let me conclude with a couple of thoughts about the importance of the plan and also some of the first new changes to the plan that occurred in the 80s because it's related to governance. What this plan did is it renewed and really formalized the relationships that had existed since 1965. It asked the members to kind of goose their game here and do more than what they had in the past, to do something larger than the individual agencies, and created sort of a new personal sense of responsibility to this process. The first new members of this plan, this is finally where the tribes come in. You didn't hear the tribes even mentioned in the up until pretty much about the 1970s and 80s. There were court decisions that brought the tribes into governance in Great Lakes fisheries. The Gurneau decision and U.S. v. Michigan, the Voigt case, and so on, were major decisions that basically the court said on the U.S. side, the states couldn't manage on behalf of the tribes. They had the right to manage the fishers in their waters and certainly on reservation. So essentially the courts affirmed the tribal rights to regulate their fisheries. I'm very proud to say when I read the minutes that the Great Lakes Fishery Commission was actually, and Carlos Fedorov was some of the first to realize this and chart a path for the tribes to join the lake committee process. When I interviewed tribal folks about this, tell me about what was going on in the 1980s in your mind. The tribes had to prove themselves. I remember when my colleagues and I went to our first technical committee meeting in 1982, people couldn't believe that the tribes would actually hire a biologist and had people on staff. Others told me, hey, you know what, we just kind of showed up at the meetings, and by the time, as time rolled on, they just accepted us, and by the time they signed the Joint Strategic Plan, it was a basic formality in it. We weren't necessarily invited to the Lake Committee and technical committees, we just sort of showed up, said one tribal person. Here's the progression. In the spring of '85, the tribes petitioned to become members. We went back and forth with some information, and about a year and a half later, the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, after consulting the other signatories to the plan, had agreed to the tribes joining it, and as we say, the rest is history. This completes then the governance in the Great Lakes Basin, with the states, the province, and the tribes then joining and being part of the U.S. tribes being part of the governance process. I should say, by the way, Canada has a very different path on how they deal with the First Nations, and that's why the First Nations are dealt with differently. The courts there have essentially ruled that the provincial and federal governments don't necessarily deny the rights of the First Nations to manage their fisheries just because they're doing management in their waters. That's a whole different story. So there was a 1997 revision to the plan, which created the Council of Great Lakes Fishery Agencies, and then just last year we had the latest member, the 1854 Treaty Authority, added to the plan. Let me conclude with a big thank you for not only for your attention in this sort of 200 years of history of Great Lakes governance, but also for everything that you do to make this process the success that it is. This is a voluntary, consensus-based process, and it's only going to work so long as the members of the process continue to consider it to be valuable to them. So thank you very much.